So last week we were getting in the boat was the idea. Get in the boat with Jesus. And Jesus, the Pharisees did not have faith, and therefore they missed the boat. They did not get in the boat and go with Jesus. But the disciples did. So we have to approach Jesus with faith and get in the boat. Get in the car. Get in the boat. This week, we're in the boat, and we're looking around the boat, and there's only one loaf of bread. And we think, it's like the pre-hurricane when there's one case of water left and you're elbowing the old lady out of the way. It's that survival mode, self-preservation we can all fall into. I think that's really what I'm calling it here today is the yeast of the world, because it happens to us. Yesterday there was a dad at Noah's soccer game that was embarrassing himself, and by what he was screaming out at 11-year-old children and the referee and our coach, and it's and really what I actually felt for him, because I've been, you watch your kid playing and the juices get flowing, and some of the stuff he's saying, I've just fortunately, had the same thoughts, but they didn't come out of my mouth. And there's, and Murray, I would have embarrassed Murray to no end, and sometimes still do when I yell at the referee, because I know more about soccer than most of these guys out there. But so it is like this infection that takes over, and it not only takes over us, but those around us, and it is like those pre-hurricane days where you're just all of a sudden this yeast kicks in, and we're all in self-preservation mode. I read recently, I don't know if this is a theory or it's historical fact, but the Vikings, what happened with them is there was this gigantic volcanic eruption, and it darkened the sky, and their crops were ruined. And so that was actually the motivation for them to go and then ravage Europe. These are Scandinavians. They'd be perfectly happy sailing, listening to music, playing a box drum. They have no problems. They're tranquil and serene people. But start to take away their supplies, and they lose it, and it can happen to us all. And so it's the yeast of the world, and it's everywhere. It's on the soccer field. It's in the business world and in our workplaces. We can go into that self-preservation mode, and the difficult part about it, the problem, is that then we hurt other people when we're doing that. In trying to get what's ours, we can hurt others. And there's one loaf. It's not going to feed everybody. So the yeast kicks in our mind, and we think, I'm going to get mine somehow, and it's going to be at the expense of others. And we see this. This is really the connection in these. When I read this early this week, I was thinking, what connection is here? And what is this yeast of the Pharisees that I'm supposed to understand? It really Jesus is like, you decide you don't get it, you don't understand, and it's like, well, help us out too, because we're not sure exactly what you're talking about. So it was a challenge. What's the connection? What is this yeast? But going back to the Joseph story, we see it in the patriarch tradition. We see that there's only one loaf of bread. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Who got the loaf of bread? Isaac. And Ishmael had to leave. Isaac had two sons, twins, Esau and Jacob. Who got the loaf of bread? Jacob, that rascal. He deceived his father, and took the loaf, took the whole thing, the entire blessing. Remember when Esau returned from hunting and came back, and they realized the ruse had happened, and Esau said, "Bless me too, Father." And he said, "Son, I have nothing else to give. I've given the entire blessing. I've given everything to your brother. I have nothing else." And so he had given the entire loaf is passed down. And this is an important part of why this story has extended beyond just Joseph reconciling back with his family. It's to see, okay, who's the next patriarch? Who's it going to be? Remember, Joseph's brothers, what was their whole motivation in wanting to kill Joseph, throwing him into the cistern, pulling him out, selling him into slavery? It was this yeast, wasn't it? It was the yeast of the world. It was that he's obviously the favorite. He's going to get the loaf of bread. Let's get rid of him, and then maybe one of us will get it. It happens throughout the history of the world. Going back to Cain and Abel, really. That yeast kicks in, that self-preservation mode kicks in, and we're willing to harm other people. We almost justify it by, well, I have to win. The only way I can win is to beat someone else. And so it just infects us. I mean, it's all over. We see it all over, and it's easily, and we see it all over our society, and then it starts infecting us. And we want to beat the other side into submission because we need to get ours. And so he says it's the yeast of, Jesus does give us, there's some clues. What is this yeast? He says it's the yeast of the Pharisees, and in Mark, the yeast of Herod. And so the best, always when you have a question in the Bible, you want to look around the immediate surrounding area. It's like if you've lost your keys. Go to the immediate area first, and then maybe you can find the answer. Don't jump off somewhere else or to another gospel. Stay in Mark, look in the immediate context, and see what you can find. So we find a couple interactions with the Pharisees. We have the Pharisees asking Jesus for a sign, and Jesus could see, and Mark describes them as they were coming to discredit Jesus. They were coming to ask him for a sign with the intent, the opposite of faith, but to discredit him, to destroy him. And so you see that self-preservation. Why would the Pharisees want to get rid of a healer? Why would they? This man is obviously gifted. Why get rid of him? Why isn't there space enough for him? But no. They're the establishment. They're the ones with power. In order to preserve what they have, they had to harm Jesus. They had to get rid of Jesus. And if they can't discredit him, then they'll just take it a step farther in order to preserve themselves. And also there was an interaction just before that with the Pharisees. There's this pattern. Jesus feeds a lot of people, gets on a boat, confronts Pharisees, and heals somebody. And it happens again. And then he feeds a bunch of people, gets on a boat, confronts Pharisees, and heals somebody. It happens twice in Mark, right in a row. Once in Israel with Jewish folks, and then he goes outside and does it with the Gentile folks. So there's something to that. And what in the two confrontations with the Pharisees, one's the sign, and then the other one is when the Pharisees are saying, your disciples are eating with unclean hands. How could you let that happen? Your ministry has no purity. It has no law, no blessing, no purity. And Jesus then goes on to explain and gives a couple of examples of, you are holding on to human traditions, and in doing that, losing grip of the commandments of God. So they were harming people in order to preserve themselves and their power. They were harming people and allowing that to happen. instead of holding on to the commandments of God, which Jesus interpreted as loving God and loving others. That's what's important. And you guys are switching it around and losing it. In the yeast of your self-preservation, you're trying to be in control. And in doing that, you're distorting God's law and allowing people to harm each other instead of love one another, which is the essence of the law, the essence of God's command. And so what we see here then with Jacob is he breaks through. What we have here in just this short little passage in the Joseph story, the Jacob story, we have a breakthrough. He says, okay, now I give you. Here we are. This is it. This is the will is being read. This is read it and weep time. Here it comes. And Joseph's there, and Joseph knew, and we don't have anything, the storyteller doesn't tell us about Joseph's intentions, but he and the brothers were all expecting, okay, Jacob's dying, now who's it going to be? Who's going to get the loaf? This has been the patriarch tradition. Who's going to get it? And then Jacob says here, he says, now son, I'm going to die, and I give to you, wait for it. Everybody's wondering what happens. I give to you one more ridge than your brothers. I mean, the significance of that is enormous in this story, in the whole story of Genesis, of this one loaf being passed, the whole thing being passed to a next patriarch. All of a sudden, wait, and it's been since the beginning Joseph, and now Joseph is found again, and Joseph is obviously blessed by God. And so Joseph may have been expecting, and probably everybody else was, here you go, Joseph. You're the king now. You're the patriarch. It's you. Instead, well, we'll give you one more ridge than your brothers, which in essence means, wait a second, you're cutting up the loaf. You're giving the brothers so the brothers get something then. I might get a little bit more. I get one more ridge, but they actually get something. So this is an enormous breakthrough. The loaf is being cut. And remember, Jesus said, don't you remember, and he says this specifically, don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves? Don't you remember when I broke that bread? What happened? 5,000 were fed. Don't you remember? So Jacob has this enormous breakthrough. In this blessing, what he focuses on is what's really important. The real blessing, do we really buy into the idea that life is all about getting what's ours at the expense of someone else, storing it up, and then we've got it and success? Is that what life is? I mean, really, I think that's kind of what we're telling each other and almost what we're telling our children. Go get yours at the expense of others if you have to, because you got to get yours. And that's life. And that's success. And that's what life is all about. You got to work hard. Nothing wrong with hard work, of course. But there seems to be this mentality that there's only so much to go around, so you better get yours. And we're training you from the very beginning, from when you're 10 years old on a soccer field, go get yours at the expense of others. That's a win. Is this what life is? Because that's what we're teaching. That's what is in our society in spades. It's a yeast that's very hard to protect yourself from. And Jesus is saying, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. And so Jacob breaks the loaves. He's explained this to Joseph, and he says this. Then Israel said to Joseph, I am about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. Do you see? What really matters, Joseph, is that God is with you. That's the real blessing. You know, God is with you. Everything else then is therefore taken care of. There is no need for the self-preservation mode. We've already won. Right, Alex? We've already won. We don't need to, there's no need for that. We don't have to allow that yeast to take over us. We've already won. God is with us in abundance. Is there only one loaf in the boat for Jesus? Can he not feed everyone? Do we not understand? Mark has repeated this again. Okay, you guys are worried there's only one loaf in this boat? Don't you remember? I took 5 loaves and fed 5,000. I took 7 loaves and fed 4,000. Don't fall into that. Don't be infected by that yeast. God is with you. Jesus is saying, I'm in the boat with you. You have nothing to worry about, including a storm even. Remember? You just don't have to fall into that mode because you've already won. He is your provider. He is with you. And we see time and time again over the course of our, Kevin and I were talking about all the money that we can think back, and Kevin's talking about all the money he put into his old boat. You know, anybody can relate with that and think, boy, I would have done a lot better if I put that in an IRA, right? And we think of those things, don't we? And you know what? God is our provider. I mean, it doesn't mean we're financial, doesn't give us, we can't take it to the other extreme and then be financially irresponsible. But God is our provider. We don't have to go into self-preservation mode. He didn't create us that way. He didn't put Adam and Eve in the garden and say, fight it out for yourselves. There's limited resources. Goodbye. I'll watch from a distance. You know, I mean, why do we fall into this? We have God is with us. We have Jesus with us. He is our provider. He can do anything he wants. Do we doubt that he can provide? He has provided for us up to this very minute. And not only for us, but people who don't even believe in him or like him. He's providing for them as well. The rain comes on the righteous and the unrighteous, and that's the good rain, the rain that grows crops. And we have this kind of, but the yeast infects us, and we need to break free. And so here is your loaves right here at the table, broken for you. Jesus is preparing the disciples. This is, in Mark, this is towards the end of Jesus' time with the disciples, his time in Galilee. And in Mark, Jesus is in Galilee. He decides to go to Jerusalem. He takes one trip to Jerusalem, one climactic trip to Jerusalem, and that's it. He's there for a week, and he's on the cross, and he's resurrected again. That's it in Mark. That's how it's laid out. And this is the end of his time in Galilee, actually, and then he's going outside of Galilee, but his time in the north, and soon he is going to turn towards Jerusalem, and he's going to tell the disciples more than once, this is exactly what's going to happen. I mean, he could say, it's very similar to this, Genesis 48:21. Then Jesus said to the disciples, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. And God will lead you to the promised land. And so today what we have and what we're celebrating and what we're taking part in, just as the disciples, he said, don't you remember he had already given them an object lesson? Don't you remember you were carrying around baskets and filling them up with leftovers so that they could remember? And this is a remembrance here where we actually get to touch and feel and be part of. The dividing wall has been broken. We have won. We are forgiven. We are provided for. God is with us, and He will lead us on.